kind of interesting because the whole notion of convergence was conceived probably about a dozen years ago, and at a very different time in terms of accounting and financial reporting. And that was really a point in time where the international standards weren't quite where they are today in terms of their quality. Now we fast forward to today, and obviously we've had a fair amount of convergence over the years in terms of US GAAP and IFRS. But I think the real issue is, are we there in terms of being able to pull a trigger now and actually begin to adopt the standards? And that's really the threshold question in terms of the IFRS roadmap. And that is that do we at some point just adopt IFRS, or do we continue down this convergence path? And certainly there's been a fair amount of discussion about the pros and cons of convergence relative to adoption. I think what's interesting is that if you look at some of the more recent convergence efforts that have been ongoing between IFRS and US GAAP, convergence does not mean the same. In fact, if you look at what actually has happened in terms of standards coming out of the convergence agenda, they don't often result in identical standards, and that's one of the issues that we're seeing now with the financial crisis in terms of arbitrage between standards and assertions of one, a company in a certain country having a disadvantage relative to, say, a U.S. company because GAAP may be slightly different than IFRS. And so I think really the key question here for the SEC and for policymakers is, are we at that point in time now we really should be thinking about adopting the standards, and that's what the roadmap really is asking. Relative is really many, certainly if you're a multinational company, you're having to deal with IFRS likely already today. The reality is that if you look outside the U.S., the vast majority of countries around the world have embraced IFRS in some way, shape, or form. There's well over 100 countries that have adopted IFRS in terms of public reporting requirements. So there's a very high likelihood if you're a multinational, regardless of where you're domiciled, in the U.S. or not, you're going to have to deal with an IFRS reporting requirement. So I think many companies today realize that and already are taking steps to make sure that they understand what those requirements are in terms of how they affect them from a local reporting perspective. Then you lop on top of that what's happening here in the U.S. with respect to public company reporting coming out of the SEC, and that's another level of reporting in terms of global financial statements. But certainly it's fair to say IFRS is affecting really all multinational companies, regardless of where they're located. It's interesting. I think there's a lot of things we can learn from companies that have adopted IFRS already. There was well over 78,000 companies that adopted IFRS in Europe back in 2005, and I think that a couple of lessons learned there that I think are important for consideration, not just for U.S. companies, but companies anywhere that are adopting IFRS. One would be don't wait. Certainly, one of the lessons learned is procrastinating, waiting to the last possible moment to begin to adopt IFRS really is going to cause you more problems than what you want to deal with. One is it's going to result probably in a lot higher cost in terms of just getting things done in a very short time frame. And also that's going to possibly result in you actually making some mistakes in terms of adoption. So one of the things we've seen with working with companies is taking a more measured approach in terms of looking at these issues up front, understanding what the timeline is, understanding kind of what the impact is on a company. How long is it going to take you to deal with it? And then from there, figure out what the optimal timeline is in terms of actually implementing IFRS. Perhaps the biggest challenge in terms of IFRS knowledge really is not so much a technical one. It's actually more of a cultural issue and kind of perspective around financial accounting, and kind of put some context around that. If we think about US GAAP for a moment, US GAAP obviously is very detailed based. People often refer to US GAAP as being rules based. Obviously there are principles in GAAP, but I think it's fair to say there's a fair amount of detail out there, much more detail than what we have in the international standards. And so the challenge that us accountants in the U.S. oftentimes have in terms of applying U.S. GAAP is trying to figure out, where to go in terms of the answers. We have literally 20+ thousand pages of guidance, and we instinctively know as U.S. accountants that the answer is somehow contained in one of those pages. It's a question of finding it. And so it's much more of a research function. Now, contrast that with what we're looking at in terms of IFRS. A very different approach. While many of the same principles exist in terms of standards, and the good news here is a lot of the detailed US GAAP, or a lot of the detailed IFRS standards, actually are based in large part on US GAAP concepts. So the learning curve isn't so much steep in terms of just knowing some of the base concepts. Where the challenge comes in for companies and for executives and folks is to understand what the perspective is. And what we're talking about here is more looking at using judgment and applying standards. So you don't have so much the detail to look to, but you have really to think through what those judgments mean, how you apply basic concepts and principles. That's a very different thought process than what you're used to from a U.S. GAAP perspective. Well, I think it's fair to say that there's obviously, with the economic crisis going on, there's been a lot more focus on those issues in terms of the regulatory structure process, what it means for companies, and obviously thinking about a full-blown IFRS conversion probably isn't top of mind right now for a lot of companies. Now, having said that, certainly IFRS is still here, will be here, and if you look at where we're heading, certainly we're moving towards a single set of accounting standards globally. That means IFRS at some point. Well, we don't have total certainty yet in terms of where the SEC may be heading with respect to timelines. I think it's fair to say that we're still walking down a path of talking about adopting IFRS at some point in the future. So companies, one, should be mindful of that and still begin to think about what all this means for them. Obviously, companies should be thinking about what the big ticket effects are. There's been a lot of talk about convergence and what that means. Obviously, there's a number of areas where the IFRS standards and U.S. GAAP aren't going to converge. We know about that. Areas like asset impairment testing and tangible accounting. Those are going to affect companies at some point when they begin to adopt IFRS. So getting a handle on what those accounting issues are, being mindful of what some of the convergence initiatives are, I think is something companies should be thinking about right now. I think the other side of it is making sure that you're getting buy-in from your senior executives, from your leadership, in terms of making sure they understand what the current regulatory landscape is, what the company's doing in terms of monitoring these issues. And then the other point I would make here is certainly, again, many multinational companies are having to deal with IFRS already more from a subsidiary reporting perspective outside the U.S. That's something companies should be actually dealing with right now. Actually, it has nothing to do with the SEC roadmap. It really is a case where many companies, frankly, don't even know that they may have IFRS reporting requirements currently outside the U.S. and making sure that the companies understand that and have a process around having a consistent philosophy around IFRS implementation to the extent that they already are implementing IFRS is important and should be done right now.